In round 3 of the Tata Steel Masters, the top 2 German players faced each other. Vincent Keymer against Matthias Blübaum. Now, Keymer has had an excellent 2025. He shot into the top 10 in the world. He's currently rated number 5 in the world. And he came so close to qualifying for the candidates in the FIDE Grand Swiss tournament in Samarkand. His crunch game came in round 10 and he faced Matthias Blübaum. Keymer was a pawn up in an endgame. He was squeezing away really nicely. Looked like he was on the verge of winning by taking a second pawn, but Blübaum hit him with a trick right at the end and managed to hold the draw. And in fact, instead of Keymer, it was Blübaum that managed to qualify for the candidates. A lot of people in Germany, while a lot of people elsewhere were kind of disgusted actually, saying, oh, it should be Keymer going to the candidates. But he didn't score when he had the chance, and Blübaum fully deserved his place. Well done to him. But there is no doubt that, in terms of rankings, Keymer is the number 1 in Germany. As I said, he's currently number 5 in the world. But Matthias Blübaum is on form. In 2025, he won the European Individual Championship. He'd already won in 2022. So, he has form. He has a good track record. And away from the chessboard, Blübaum is a mathematician. In fact, he completed his master's in maths going into the summer. And it feels like since then, he's been kind of liberated on the chessboard. And he's been doing pretty well. So while Keymer and Blübaum have good relations, they're obviously rivals. And all eyes are going to be on them as the top 2 German players when they play. Blübaum started the Tata Steel Masters with 2 solid draws. Keymer had a win and a loss. In fact, we saw that he lost disastrously against Fedoseev in round 2. So what would happen in their game in round 3? Let's take a look. Keymer started with c4 and it very quickly went into a Queen's Gambit like this. And Keymer went for the exchange variation and Bishop g5. So this is very much in fashion. And Blübaum went for h6 and castles kingside. So this is also a very reliable way of playing for black. And here Keymer went for bishop g3, a slightly mysterious move. Let's just see what happens if white were to castle. Black's idea is to play knight e4, getting the knight to the outpost. And if bishop takes, queen takes, black is really comfortable in that position. That's well known. So the idea of bishop g3 is to discourage knight e4, because if knight e4 now, that can be taken, and that's a pretty safe extra pawn. The check will be met by the knight just dropping back again. So basically this move, bishop g3, just keeps black a little bit bottled in. Bishop g4 from Blübaum. Okay, that's again, it's well known. So bringing the bishop into play, maybe exchanging it off. So just clearing a bit of the congestion in the camp there. Queen b3. So exploiting the fact that the bishop has come out early to hit the b7 pawn. And Blübaum responds with queen b6. So if white exchanges, then that's very useful for black, having the semi-open file. Likewise, if black exchanges, that could be useful for white. Anyway, Keymer played knight e5. And the bishop dropped back to e6. And now a really aggressive move from Keymer. He went with f4. So every time you make a pawn move, you have to think, what are the consequences? And the consequences of this are the fact that this pawn on e3 is weakened, as well as the square in front of it. Now, on the positive side, the f-pawn could be used to start an attack. Many of you will know that this formation with the knight on e5 is known as the Pillsbury attack, and in the early decades of the 20th century, then this was seen as just very, very powerful for white. But, well, it's not so clear. So, knight g4 played. I mean, there are other ways to play this. One could just move the knight to a6, but knight g4. So, looking to try to clear the e file, and then you can get pressure on that pawn on e3. But after knight g4, f5 played. So now two pieces are threatened. So knight takes knight, bishop takes knight. And now the bishop dropped all the way back to c8 because you want to keep open the d7 square for the knight. And bishop f4. Okay, that's just preempting knight d7, which came. Keymer thought for 17 minutes over his next move. He could just kind of calm things down here, exchange queens, for example, and get castled, or maybe put the king in the middle, something like this. It looks roughly level. You could also just castle here as well. Also seems reasonable. But he played h3 instead. So he's looking to get in g4 and to perhaps get a pawn storm going on the king side. And Blübaum took the chance to give a check. And if g3, well, that can be taken. Let's just see that very quickly. Takes and rook e3 check, and you can see that black will regain the bishop. So after bishop h4 check, Keymer had obviously planned this and fairly quickly played king d2. Well, the king does sometimes stay in the middle in these kinds of queen's gambit positions. But now we've got a very interesting position on the board. So here is where I'd like you to have a think. I'm going to have a drink. What did Blübaum play here? What would you play here with black? Black to play. Cheers. I've seen many chessboards in my life, but when I heard about this one, I was keen to see it for myself. It's beautiful and completely wireless, thanks to an integrated battery and Bluetooth connection. For my edition, I wanted pieces that reflect clarity. When I play with them, everything feels natural. Just me, the board, and the game I love. This is my supreme chess set, the Daniel King edition. Don't forget that patrons of the PowerPlayChess channel can receive a €100 discount on the Daniel King chess set. Right, now back to the game. The king's in the middle. So Blübaum thought to himself, well, if the queens are exchanged, then the king probably needs to be in the middle and solidly protects e3. However, if the queens remain on the board, then that could be a little bit problematic for the king. And so that's why he played queen d8. He saw a chance to attack. And if you look, with all these advanced pawns, it means actually if black manages to break through, then the king won't have much cover. However, there are lots of pieces on the board. Let's see what happened. g3 from Keymer, just pushing the bishop back. I mean, bishop g5 looks reasonable here, but he played bishop e7 instead. So he really is trying to keep as many pieces on the board as possible to make life for the king as uncomfortable as possible. Rook c1, maybe Keymer was thinking, yeah, if I can run to b1, then the king will feel a bit more secure. So knight b6, well, that's heading in the right direction. might land on c4. g4, so protects the pawn. Yeah, if, for example, well, I don't know, randomly, h4, then knight c4 check is actually very annoying. Because if that's taken, then bishop takes f5, the bishop comes into the game. The bishops feel like they have a lot of potential here, and the king is not at all safe. So g4. So this is one of the ideas, of course, of playing g4 to just cement the pawn chain, and it means that that bishop can't get into the game so easily. But Blübaum played very consistently and decided to try to open up the center. So obviously there's a threat to play here, but yeah, things are opening anyway. So Keymer decided to take on c5. Blübaum mentioned that he thought maybe queen d1. He wasn't quite sure what to play against that. But I think if black just develops bishop d7 and rook c8, then it feels like that's problematic for white. I think the problem is that it's very hard to get this attack going with the pawns because the bishop does a really good job of controlling these squares. Anyway, after a long think, almost 20 minutes, Keymer exchanged on c5. And it's not possible to take on d5. White would like to do that, but if knight takes, then queen takes. And there's a nice little Zwischenzug or Zwischenschach. An in-between move, you check the king, and then you take the queen, and black is a piece up. So after bishop c5, king c2. So Keymer is trying to reach safety. And he decides it's worth it to he gives up a pawn. But it's a pretty safe pawn for black. The only thing is, can you bring these pieces into the game? Well, in fact, you can very quickly. Bishop d7. And the rook is going to arrive on c8. In the meantime, black is really solid in the middle. That extra pawn is pretty useful. Queen b4. Yeah, the queen wasn't doing much on b3, so starts to move into the game. Queen h4. Excellent move. And in fact, all these pawns are vulnerable. If the h3 pawn disappears, then the other pawns are going to be really weak. So rook e3, but now the queen enters. Check. Hitting the rook. Queen g1, that queen is lurking beautifully. And it means the king has not been able to run into the corner, and it's still a bit stranded. Rook e7. Well, okay, but everything is protected. Rook c8. Now things are starting to look very dangerous with that pin. d4, for example, threatened. King d2. King steps out of the way, but knight c4 check. Takes. Rook takes c4. Hitting the queen. Well, you can see that, well, white's king is looking very shaky in the middle of the board. Not a lot of cover. Now, I think there are several very strong moves for black here, but Blübaum found actually a slightly surprising killer move here, an absolute killer. Bishop a4. And Keymer resigned. So it looks slightly odd to put the bishop at the side of the board, but let's understand how strong this is. Well, first of all, if knight takes a4, then in fact the king is chased to its doom. And if rook takes f7, well, let's see what the threat is. Queen check. King d3, rook d4 check, or knight e2, and queen e3 mate. There we go. Absolutely decisive, and there really is no good defense after bishop a4. Yeah, basically the queen and rook are going to decide very quickly whatever white plays in this position. Well, I have to say, a really convincing victory by Matthias Blübaum, and it looked like Keymer was still playing a little bit like yesterday, where some of his moves were just a bit too loose, looked a bit like wishful thinking. So, for example, here, I mean, f4 isn't necessarily so bad, but still, positionally, it's very loose indeed. And I think with knight g4, Blübaum started the process of clearing the e-file, and then pawn on e3 was exposed. And later on, well, it wouldn't have been so bad if Keymer had put the brakes on and, for example, on this move, on this turn, just exchanged queens. He could have done that in several earlier moves as well. It should be okay for white, basically, after the queen exchange, but he left it too late. And after queen d8, this is a very, very uncomfortable position for white. Okay, let's see the standings. Well, we have a pile-up after 3 rounds. There are 5 players on 2 out of 3. Niemann, Van Foreest, Erigaisi, Blübaum and Abdusatorov. And would you believe, at the bottom of the tournament table, Pragg and Geary on half out of 3. Who would have predicted that?